my name is Benedict. Today's video is a mix walkthrough, so it's one of the series of things I do. If you haven't encountered them before, where and when I can, either I'll find something and make the offer, or someone will come to me. I love it when people come to me. I find a track that I think is a great track, but has kind of missed the mark in its mix, and pick that up and do my own mix. Now, I'll say right from the beginning, when I say I do my own mix, I do my own mix. So it's to show what a good mix engineer, good balance engineer, or a creative balance engineer, think what you want, will do to bring their thing to an existing track. The aim always being not to say, look at me, I'm so fancy and clever, because that's just, it's to say, look at this track. Look at what the person who wrote this track has done. Look how fancy and clever this track is. Look how beautiful this track is. That's the whole aim of what a balance engineer is trying to do. So conversely, there are times where, and thankfully it didn't happen in this instance, but there are times where people go, no, it's my mix, you have to do it. And, you know, sometimes they're right. Like Lars was right about justice. It's better without that bass. It's a more record. But let your engineer find those amazing things. You can always look at alternate mixes, but let them find it. That's what they're there for. So, the track is called Pharaoh's Dynasty by a fellow called frank1985 that I found through KVR. I've known him a tiny bit here and there. I heard this track, and I wasn't the only one saying, hey, look, Frank, something's wrong in this mix. Few people were giving the usual kind of technical things of like, oh, you just do this or do that, pan this and what have you, but straight away I could tell that the fundamental problem was that Frank wasn't clear on his story. Now, I asked him about story and he was a little unsure. Like a lot of people, he's actually heard some of my stuff, you know, watched some of my videos on story, but he did this without sort of being clear about necessarily what his scene was. He used a lot of Arabic, Egyptian type instruments, and so felt like, oh, well, Pharaoh's Dynasty was a nice title, and it is a really nice title. It's grand, it's epic. So good on you, good call. But when it came to the mix, he kind of lost perspective of what his piece was trying to say. Now, as we'll see as we get into it, his piece is very delicate and quite detailed. There isn't much in there that has an obvious, here's my melody. It's a little like funk in the sense that the whole is made of a lot of disparate parts. Sometimes we could be a little unkind and say sometimes it's almost like throwing a pile of bolts on a tray and then finding a machine come from it. As you'll hear as I go through and look at the individual tracks and we solo them out and listen to what they are, they often don't have a complete line on their own at all. But you put them together, and once we get that mix right, we start to have something come through. So we'll start to walk you through some stuff and then I'll play you the whole thing. Then you can either go, or you can sit back and watch really all the decisions that I made as I mixed this. So we'll start with the original as what I heard from the start. Oops, forgive me whilst I be a doofus, I forgot to hit solo, original. Now the first thing you'll notice is it's awfully quiet. You can see that there, awfully quiet. If you're going to do a mix, at least, as soon as you publish it, at least bring it up to a listenable level. So I'll give you a bit of a hand there, and we'll add about 3 dB. So like me, you'll probably hear that there wants to be an atmosphere, but there kind of isn't. And that there's tension between the parts. Now that was what really grabbed me once I got the volume up, was, and there's this tension between the parts, but it doesn't resolve, it doesn't have a sense of center. And that's from Frank just not being really clear on, where's my target, what am I mixing, what's the scene that I am setting here. This doesn't have a story in the terms of, I woke up in the morning and I combed my hair and, I whipped a few slaves. It's more a scene, it's a something over time, vastness of time kind of a feel. But he hadn't focused his elements quite right, and you probably feel that too. Now the flute bits are nice. There are several flutes in there. You just notice that there are some little bits and pieces of voice in there too, which is nice. And then his ending. What you've probably also noticed is it feels very the same all the way through. I know you don't get to hear the whole thing, but at any point we dip into there, it's kind of the same. Now, time's all about change. Now, sometimes if we look over a period of time, we go, it sucked then, it sucked then, it sucked then, it sucked then, it sucks today, it's probably going to suck tomorrow. But, yeah, that's all right, you're allowed to express that. There's nothing wrong with that. But you've still got to show a sense of hope and drama. And he missed that here, which was a shame, because straight away I could tell, there's something really interesting in here, but it got missed. So we'll pop that back. Straight away you can hear, well, everything's come up and it all feels kind of alive and textured and detailed and clear. We've given some focus to the mix. You'll see that Frank's track starts here. I've started his track back here. I've added a little bit to it. Now, Frank, before you get concerned, or anybody else who's watching this gets concerned, I'll show you that what I've added is stuff that was in here already. So just like if you watched the guy produce Tech House track, I've taken some key parts from in here, carried them forward, so that we get a nicer intro, because our piece just starting is just not as exciting as it should be. There's no lead in, it's just kind of a cold start. And seeing this as a subtle track, we really want people to feel, and their deep feelings, we want to kind of lead them in, lead them through. I think that's basically all I want to show you here. I'll just again sort of A-B between the... That's his ending. See, same as it was all the way through. We've now got a really nice lyrical lead in there. Again, one of the first things that I thought when I heard this was all these little sort of arguing parts that have this kind of sandy feel, and that's great, but at no point do they really kind of come together. So I said to Frank, I said, hey, well, actually what I asked him for was, hey, can I have all the MIDI? He'd been doing all this in free loops, so it was all working on stems, but I said, hey, can I have the MIDI for the whole arrangement? Because I want to look at making another line. I probably would have picked it up more sort of from the middle, but he sent me over a section which you'll see, and it's actually really nice. It's really good and it fits in beautifully. A little shorter than I would have planned, but if you listen to the whole piece, like if you have it on the background or whatever, and you get to that point, you get to this point, you suddenly get this great payoff, and that was the whole idea, is what I was looking for, to have this nice, we've got bits and pieces kind of arguing, never really having a clear line, as I said, But together they create something, to then having a single, triumphant march towards the end. Really good. So it makes the piece finish really, really nicely. And that's some of what I've echoed at the front. So yeah, that's probably all we need to do. Just to, again, remind you, we started here. And we ended here. Preamble done. Here's the actual piece. Now here's where I will play through the whole piece for you, and you can just listen to it. So if you come over here to hear Frank's piece, just because you want to hear Frank's piece, here it is. So there we have it. Pharaoh's Dynasty by frank1985 with a really, like a good mix that shows off all the parts. As you see, there's quite a bit. There are quite a few parts in there. And as you see, a lot of it's percussive. Some parts go on kind of the whole way through. But again, it's made out of little bits and pieces. I will give a criticism first, and this is a common criticism just about all mix engineers are going to give you. But you can avoid this very easily. Now, it's exported out of Fruity. I think I've had funny things come out of Fruity before, but you see that every stem is called Pharaoh. Every single stem. So when I brought these in, every single instrument was called Pharaoh. And that meant that when I opened up my mixer to have a look, it was the instrument called Pharaoh, 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 the instrument... You get my point. It was real hard to tell what anything was. So please, when you export, look carefully at what you're sending. Don't assume that they're getting a brain dump of you. They're not. Your engineer is getting what you send them, and it comes cold. So remember to give the track tempos. If there is MIDI, then give them key and scale. It's always worth giving them key and scale, because if if you send this off to Trevor Horn and he goes, "Look, your bass line sucks. I'm going to play a bass line," you wouldn't say no. Now Trevor may well be able to just go, "Oh, yep, that's in Q major with a seventh augmented," but don't make him do the thinking. Just say, "Hey, look, this is my key and scale. It costs you nothing." So cover those things, but also make sure that your tracks are going to make sense as soon as they're put in. If you've got empty tracks, don't send them. Just go through, scan what you've got, kill it. Don't make people wonder, why is this track empty? Am I missing something? Because if they're not missing anything, don't send it to them. Not only is it a waste of time to download, but it's confusion. Don't set your engineer up to start with the feeling of any kind of confusion. It's not a great place for you to be. So I had to go through, work out what things were. There was one instrument that was completely misnamed. It was named as drums, and it turned out to be a flute. Sorry, but you don't want to do that. I found it after some confusion as to why I'm getting flutes appearing in my drum section, but really take that extra time. It shouldn't take you long. Set yourself up so that your engineer gets it and goes, "Hey, I'm in this track as quickly as can be," because it just took extra time to do. And whilst on that, there was one rather amusing one where there was a track just called HS. 30 plus years of music, and I don't know everything about it at all, especially not ethnic instruments. What the hell's an HS? I ended up deciding it must be a hirsute slatin, because who wouldn't want those? But I was confused. There was no immediate sense of, well, what's its role? So a bit of a joke, but at the same time, please, it makes sense to you what an HS is. Is it going to make sense to anybody else who walks into this track? Being organized is super important for you, not for me. It helps me tremendously, because I don't have to waste time trying to work out what's what, or more time, because I always have to work out what's what. But it helps you because you can pick it up at any time and have a really good, clear overview. So, enough being a pain in the ass. Now, as usual, if you've watched any of these, the first thing I've done is to create groups and put things in groups. So I've taken all my drummy type instruments, put them into a drums group. Bass, I only got one of them, so he sits alone. And then the rest are really all mostly melodic instruments. I've made a group with the strings, which we'll talk about later, and again with the voices. So if I want to take any group and change it as a whole, it's easy. I can do it at the group. Plus, it just helps me to see, well, what's what. So if I look at my rack, not that one, that one. Sometimes managing all these windows is a bit of a pain. If I look at my rack, then I can go, well, that's all my drum stuff there. That's all my melodic stuff there. And this one on the end, that's all my voice stuff. Makes it much easier to navigate, which again, you just kind of want to do. So we'll close that. Now again, remember it started cold with this low pad. We had these strings here, and just through listening to them there'd been a little transition which I really liked, so I pulled it forward. Actually no, that was the second thing I did. The first thing I did was got the fluty stuff in the middle here. I think it's this bit here. I mean, that just says Egyptian like nothing on earth. Because we started cold and it took a while to kind of start to get to a lot of the bits that really made sense, I pulled it out here. So straight away that tells us a lot, far more than a synth pad sound says. A synth pad sounds, yeah, here's a great big synth pad with some block chords. Whereas that's engaging, that drags you in straight away. And that then made me realize, hang on, we need more of a transition. Just going straight from that to beginning the block chords still was, it lacked magic. So we brought in the tambourines. And you'll see that I fade these strings in and out, and then we bring in the low pad. Now the low pad's where I'm going to actually start in this case, because the low pad was actually one of the biggest problems in the mix. Not one of the biggest problems to mix, but one of the biggest problems that Frank had allowed to happen within his mix. Easy to do. He'd written these lines, and it's a great big sound, and he wanted to keep it there. It's like, oh, it's the basis of everything. This runs all the way through the piece. It's a pretty big sound. It takes a lot of real estate, and it's the same tone the whole way through. It doesn't really do anything other than just move those block chords. Nice sound. But with it being really loud, it actually swallowed everything in the mix. So it was really hard to hear any detail because it was just too much. So if we put our mix back in, focus on what happens if I take it out? What do I lose if I take it out? Now we do lose if we take it out, but the question is, how far can we pull it back to have it play its real role without swamping everything else? Because the swamping meant that it kind of took up everything, like filling your whole room with cotton wool and then wondering why you can't see your wife. Maybe that's a good thing in your case, but it's kind of not really the best way of doing things. So I've pulled that down. You look here, as it fades in, we do a kind of a crossfade between these two sections. It comes up to what was its original full volume, and then as the piece starts, there's not an awful lot going on at this point, so I can be a little bit more aggressive with it, but I fade it back out of the way just as everything else is starting. So we've given ourselves plenty of that pad, but then it gets out of the way. We notice if it's not there, but we don't spend all our time noticing it, because we're not supposed to. A pad is something that sits right underneath. What that pad is designed to do is to create that feeling of a big world. And that's all it's meant to do. So it's kind of like under the sand dunes that sits there. And after a while, you stop paying all your attention to the sand dunes. They become the backdrop for the action. And so that got pulled right back. Once I pulled that back, then everything else started to have more space and be able to breathe more. And because, as I said before, this is almost a little like a funk piece with all these little bits and pieces that Lego themselves together to create something, we need to hear them more clearly. And it allows all those textures to come out. Now we'll work through the instruments. We'll just work through them in the racks, probably the easiest way to go. If they're closed up, it meant that I didn't do anything unique to them. With the darbuka drum thing. Fairly typical sample type stuff. It's recorded as clean and as perfect as possible. It's both good and bad. It's good because it's flexible. You can do whatever you choose to do to it with it. It's bad because it kind of lacks character. So my policy with mixing, and you'll see some slightly extreme examples here compared to what everyone else will tell you in their 2-minute tuts, is that I've been aggressive and I've tried to find, well, where's the character in this instrument? What do we want to hear out of this instrument? So mids, low mids, a little bit of air. We want to hear the of that without it, sounding like some kind of EDM sub bass. It's not rap, but we want to have a little bit of that because that's the area it wants to work in. I did have to go through this quite a few times, and I did have more aggressive bass boosts and what have you, tried mid boosts, but this is where I settled in the end. It actually wants to be subtle. We want to know it's there, but we don't want to spend our whole piece listening to every little thing that our hand drummer does, because it's not our lead. It's not our lead kick drum, as I've heard someone say. A shaker. Solve it. Quite bright. Tempting to leave that in the mix, really bright. But it becomes wearing. It's working up there like a cheese grater on the real highs. And what we want is to be able to express our lead instruments. And if we've got our cheese grater just over the top of it all the time, it's like when my little daughter's sitting there with her great big bucket of Lego. It's a sort of white noise that takes over the whole world, which for some reason she doesn't seem to notice. So it's good to roll off some of the tops and then to choose where we want to locate that within our mix. I actually wanted the those frequencies. I could have gone that aggressive if I really wanted to, but I didn't. I just wanted to emphasize those. It's subtle, but it allows it to sit inside the drum mix and inside the rest of the mix. It's just there in the background, which in reality you do. You have somebody standing there with his shaker thingy, maracas, what have you, doing this, and it's a background thing. It helps fill. So I didn't want that to be a lead. Tambourine's an interesting one in Eastern music. Because it plays a role unlike what we do with it. We do it with the girl who just does this. It's basically a shaker again. So it's here it's been used. It's a really percussive point, so we want that fairly clear in the mix. But you'll hear again, I've really emphasized where I want it to poke through the mix, rather than just saying, oh, there's lots of lovely highs, let's turn them up, because again, it's just going to swamp the mix. Rolled off lows, not cut them, just roll them off in this case. There's not a lot going on there, but I just don't want, because this sound does have a bit of a tap and what have you in it, I just didn't really want any of that playing much of a role without making it seem thin. Maracas. Let these be fairly broad, but again, made a pretty definite decision here, and I pulled them right into the middle of the track. So, because they're kind of an annoying sound, but in context of the track and the music, they work really well. So we get more of the clicky feel rather than the ticky feel, if you know what I mean. Now this may come as an unusual decision to Frank. We've got these instruments in here. Let's just pull them up so we can focus them. These are synthesizers, I assume. They definitely behave like square wave synths. Now he's called them arpeggios, which they kind of are. They're these funny little ostinato things that repeat. Now they appear to sort of be melodic, but they don't play a melodic role. The role they play is very much of a synthesizer, but when you put them into context of the track, they very much strike me as actually being hand drums. So rather than playing those, mixing those as though they were supposed to be a synth thing, I said, no, let's actually put them where I feel like they belong, which is as part of the percussion kit. They play a slightly melodic thing, but it's not unusual in Middle Eastern drums for them to be a bit talky. So what I did with them was EQ. So we worked on EQ for each of these guys. Then looking at that low mid sound that you feel when you're near to bongo-y type things, they have this low mid whoop out of them. It's a nice thing, and I wanted that to come through. I'm not going to push it too hard, but I'm going to push that, and then there's also a slightly higher part. I want them to cut through, not aggressively, but I just want that pop, pop, pop to be able to come through. The next guys, these are the brighter ones. And that really screams synthesizer. Overall, this doesn't feel like a synth track, even though it is a synth track, and anybody who stops to think about it will go, yeah, it's a synth track. But it is not meant to scream synthesizer track, it's meant to scream deserty, Egyptian-y thing. So this becomes a little bit of a bridge. It's got a synthy feel to it, but still behaves more like a drum. So it's brighter, still some of the pop, but allowing then we're looking for how can we emphasize some character in that. I would see a lot of guys who would come along and go, oh no, there's a bright frequency there, let's notch that out. Well, there's another frequency, let's notch that out. Now I have like 356 notches along here. It's like mental, really mental. Your sound doesn't sound like what it sounded like in the first place at all. If you're being creative, great, but if you're problem solving, you're problem creating. You're creating a weird instrument that has no character. So I've gone through, found the character. These do have a cool little ping in the higher end of them. So I found that ping up here. Let that cut through when it comes through. It's exciting. It's like, ooh, that instrument goes ping. So we give it that. We let it do that because that's what makes it unique. If we get rid of that, we just end up with a flat synthesizer and it sounds like bloody MIDI shit. It's funny for an electronic musician to say that, but we've all heard that, you know, tracks which are nothing but 28 instruments that are all sawtooths and so again, rolled off a lot of the tops. We don't want this to be too bright. It's there, comes in the middle of things. We've got other instruments that are taking the lead. We don't want to fill our air frequencies with these sorts of things. So they get summed into this bus. Because they're a pair, it's best to sum them into a bus and treat them together. It'd be tempting to get all producery and stuff and treat each one of these separately, but look, they play as a pair so often. I've panned them out, which is not unusual, because if we've either got one drummer with two hands, in which case we'd commonly pan that, or we've got two drummers. I don't know what the logic behind this, don't really care, but it's nice to sort of pan them out, but then we can bring them together. I've put an overdrive on them, so if we bypass this, the overdrive pulls a lot of the lower end out. That's the nature of this particular overdrive. Good, bad, doesn't matter. It's the nature of it. I'll use it for what it does. I like it a lot, especially in putting more grit and focus into a mix, because you don't want too much low end. I've boosted those low mids, in part because I know that this is going to cut them back out again. So we end up with rather than having a very flat frequency thing, a lot of synthesizers are very sort of even across their range, which is fair enough. You don't necessarily want them to be uneven. When you're creating something, you want to choose where they're going to be uneven. That's my job. So I've created a really sort of wiggly frequency line with them, which makes them more interesting. They sort of come and go over the different frequencies in which they behave. So this does some of that. Not a lot of drive, but just a little bit, just going to dirty them up a little bit, because synths tend to be quite clean. I've used the body here. Now the body in this fella, it's subtle. That's designed to vaguely emulate a guitar speaker. It's a kind of a resonator. But you set that, and I've set it to cover the pair of them so that they kind of come together. These two instruments act a little bit more like they're one because they're sharing this strange frequency process. Compressor on them, a fair bit of compression on them, because these are not lead instruments. We want to keep them fairly well controlled, but enough to just let the pop through and stop them from getting excitable. I've put an echo on them. Now you'll be hearing that there's a reverb, there's a bust verb across the whole thing. Actually, I might as well talk about that now. You'll see a shared reverb for everything. We have a look at our mixer here. Everything goes through it, nice and simple. The only things that don't go through it are things that are going to a bus, and the bus goes through it, because if you send the individual tracks through it, then the reverb send is not affected by what you do to the bus, which can kind of mess up your reverb balances. So that's across everything. Most things are just a default 12 dB. Bass is lower. The main lead I've gone higher, which we'll get to the main lead a little bit later. So we've got a reverb. The RV7000 in Reason's a nice reverb. It's clean, polite reverb. Sometimes that can be its downfall, that can be so clean and polite that you're a bit like, why are we doing this? So Reason being reason, and this being a new toy, I've attached this modulation effect, which gives me the options of phases, flanges, or a filter. I've already played with using filters with a little bit of drive in front of the reverb to uniquify the reverb space. In this case, I decided to actually use a phaser. Kind of a kooky idea in a sense, but it's not meant to be super aggressive. You probably not notice the phaser, but that phase moving the reverb around, so the reverb's not always the same, it's moving it around and in ways that are different, not only frequency domain, but just everywhere. It swirlifies everything. You know what a phaser is. That's just on the reverberated part of it. It helps give us some of that mystery and changeability and even some of the feel of wind blowing the sand around. If it was just that, in another type of piece, you wouldn't say that, but it helps us get some of that, so it makes our reverbs a lot less linear. Of course, there's a little bit of a roll off the lows. You commonly want to roll off the lows with your bus reverbs. Okay, back to where we were. We're looking at our arpeggios, which I'm playing as hand drums. So we've got them fairly reverby, with the reverb and the extra echoes, to let them sit back, because we don't want them on the front of the mix, because where we've got samples and then we've got synthesizers, the synthesizers can very easily just be right up in you, and then it sounds very plastic. Stems. So that really brings us to the whole drum mix. Again, earlier on I had the Dabukas with a bassier kind of a mix, but the more I went on, especially as I got to the final mix, and I mixed it and I went and I listened overnight, and it was like, it's just too drum heavy, it's too bass heavy. While it's nice to hear all that stuff going on, it's nice and detailed, it's not really letting the piece be everything that it should be. So back to done, but we've got a nice bright clear busy mix with pans left and right with the various parts, and front to back depth with the various parts as well. Next thing we have in our mix. Now in Frank's mix, this was basically missing. I'm not quite sure what his reasoning was on it, but he'd got his bass line basically gone. Don't know whether he forgot it or what went wrong, what the decision was, but it was gone. And this is cool. Excuse me as I do my Pino Palladino impersonations. That's a really nice bass line. It doesn't want to drive the track, but it helps with that feel of things sort of snaking through. So it's great to have that. Again, I looked at various different ways of doing it. Initially with that low pad, really big, there's a huge amount of bass in it. There's probably more bass in that than there is anything else in the mix. The hand drums and the bass player, they're not really dominant down there, and nor do they have to be. But pulling the pad out made me think, do I have to have more bass somewhere else? And so I'd done kind of the obvious thing of trying to boost that. But this bass lives a bit higher, rather than. So it's better to play to that. So you see that I'm boosting very broadly up here in the mids, rather than putting a great boost at 60. Because while it's going to kind of sound nice, it's actually going to mess up the piece. As well as when you've got big drums, especially very big bassy drums, and a big bass guitar, or a big EDM type sub-type bass, you anchor that thing to the ground like a bastard. You're just nailing it down, bolting it down, super gluing it, putting 38 Bibles on top of it, kind of nailing it to the ground. Whereas if we go a little higher and not have quite so much then we actually allow the piece to feel more open, more airy, more fluid. And here, this is a very fluid bass line. It's along the lines of the type of thing the Pino Palladino, to some extent Mick Kahn might do, and even Hooky from Joy Division, New Water. He played it right up here, but you get a beautiful feel from that. So bass, I've pushed hard and pushed it high to really have those overtones play nicely. I looked at putting drives and stuff on it, and in theory they sounded good, but they kind of made a mess of it more than anything else. Back to really pushing at this point. It sits best in the mix that way. We've got a short kind of slapback. It doesn't really sound like a slapback because this doesn't have an aggressive attack to it, so we're not hearing that beep, 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 beep of a slapback. But it's there, and it just fills it out a little bit. I haven't gone with chorusing or anything on this. It just allows that instrument to be there, to take up a little bit more real estate, while still being back in the mix. It needs to be behind the mix, but it snakes away in a sneaky sort of a way behind the mix. Compression. A little bit slow on the attack, because it's a slowish attack instrument. I want the main part to come through. I just want to make the beginnings sort of seem just a little bit stronger. So it's just tightening that instrument up just a little bit in our perception. It's not tightening the instrument up. We're not transient designing, but we're just changing how we feel that transient. So we feel like it's a bit more by pushing down what comes after it. Subtle, but the feel is nice. So beaut bass line. I was really pleased to actually find that and be able to put that into context. So that gives us all of our rhythmic backing. Now, the low pad, I already talked about this guy all the way through the mix. There's a lot of lows down here, and I played with, well, what do we do with them? But it's best we didn't do much with them at all. I even played with cutting them out, but that was not such a wise decision. They do sit nicely there, especially when they're lower in the mix, like really behind the mix, like right behind the mix. Because we've not got a lot of other lows going on, then I can actually use those sort of mush lows underneath the pad to give that sense of a big deep space in there. So that's cool. It really is cool. Just rolled off the garbage that nobody's going to be able to use. There's no point leaving that there in the mix. But I've boosted here, right in the middle of the frequencies. The ones they say, oh geez, don't do that, it's going to sound like paper. I want this to sound like paper. I want this to sound like paper because this is part of building the sandy feeling of the track. There's some of it there already, but we can emphasize that by just finding the place where we naturally kind of pull everything else away a little bit from the mix. We can give that just a tiny poke through there, so that even though you're not thinking of hearing it, it's always there. Little bit on the top end, because he did put some cool other stuff on top, but I don't want that to be too noticeable, which is another good thing about pulling it back, because it's got some sort of fluty type stuff inside that pad. But the problem is that it then conflicts with his actual fluty lead lines. It's like, who's playing the damn flute here? So once we pulled that back, worked really nicely. In terms of what I did to it, it's quite simple. It didn't get huge amounts of reverb. It just had the normal amount of reverb. But I did use this fella on it. It's new in the Reason 11. It's a BBD, so an ensemble type effect with a fair amount of more depth and rate. Tiny bit of noise. I did have a higher amount of noise, but there were a couple of times where that became apparent. It put a kind of grainy on top of the pad, which was not nice. It fought with everything else. There's good texture and bad texture. That became bad texture. Tiny bits okay, but because of how much else was on top, became bad texture. Acknowledging that, even though it was really cool, is an important part of what you're doing. Pull the mix back, and you can hear it there. A bit dire. But by pulling it back, we get that width. I wanted to pull this right out. This is infinity wide. The whole idea there, because that pad is to wrap around, it's the whole world. So that's really all that happened to him. The hirsute slattern, still not quite sure what that is, but we all want one. It has sort of like a low, what are those things, like a harp you play with sticks. It's kind of like one of those, only a bass one. Doesn't really matter. Its role is simple. What I did with it, the sound on its own, to be honest, doesn't have a lot going on. It's not got a lot of character. And we all want our slatterns to have plenty of character, otherwise we would lose interest in them. So it was a case of, how do I give this character without it becoming too characterful that it overtakes? So again, my friend, the drive unit. Again, overdrive. There didn't seem a lot of point focusing this in a bass region, even though there's a fair bit going on down here. It's not a bass sound. It's not like a blub, blub, blub. It's got a different role here. So this brightens it up. I've brightened it up here. I've given it a body as well. So you hear as that comes in, it starts to sound more like a real instrument. Whatever that real instrument is, it starts to sound like one. So it was a case of just tuning that resonance effect to a point where it sat and cut through the mix where it was supposed to, which was above the bass but below the leads. And then EQing to do exactly that again. Above the bass, even though our bass is also being boosted around here, but we've got a different identity now, a bit of the boost here and a little bit up here. Even though there's very little here, sometimes it's nice to put a little bit of air on something just to have it pull through. It's not playing all the time. It's a punctuation kind of thing. So no harm in letting it pull through and just go ooh when it comes through. Main lead, oddly named because it doesn't really play the main lead role. The main lead's that other flute, the one that's over on that side in your ears. But this one's an interesting one. Let's have a look at what I did to it. So it's just simply that and this. Yeah, how it's there, but it kind of disappears. But it's actually the pivot around which everything else moves. Easy to think, oh, but that's all your drums, man. It's like, no. The drums are there playing supporting parts. We can mute the drums and make our piece work. And sometimes it's a good trick to do if you're struggling to get your mix to make sense, because you've mixed from drums up and then you've got no space left. Mute all the drums, work with your instruments, get a good mix, and then bring the drums back into support. But this is the I've used this as the spine on which all the other Lego pieces are stuck. In which case, it's nice that it sits underneath, but it needs to have a kind of a strength, a power, and a quiet majesty. Not a "I'm the king" kind of a majesty. It needs to have a real regal, wise old dude kind of majesty to it. I've done that by, again, shoving it right through the middle. Haven't bothered much with air, haven't bothered with the lows, just jammed it straight down the middle. Now again, a common saw, old saw that you hear is never boost, always cut. Crap. You'll see I virtually never cut. There's very little cutting to do. The only time I cut is when something offends me. It's going to cause problems with the mix. So you'll see I cut stuff here that's got no real purpose in the mix. But only when it's got no purpose in the mix, as you saw with the pad. I kept it because it was useful in the mix. It was actually good in the mix. But this, drive as hard as you can. If you need to put 96 dB of gain on, it's probably a little excessive, but if you need to put 96 dB of gain on to pull out the character of that instrument, 96 dB of gain is exactly the right amount for you to use. Not minus 2 dB over here and minus 2 dB over here. Just boost that bastard right down the center where you need it to be, based on its character. Based on its character. And that is a really middle sound. You hear now how it really creates that. Here's the center of our mix. It travels through time and it pulls all the other bits of Lego together. It's our spindle. And we add quite a lot of echo to it. Yes, it does spit a little bit, maybe partly these cans, I'm not worried about that. If it's spitting a little bit, it's doing a great job because it sounds bloody brilliant. Because these lines, like most of the other lines here, are very separated. It's doo-doo, doo-doo. I've put a lot of echoes on there to pull them so that they flow together. Because this is being used as our spindle, you don't have a spindle that's there sometimes and not there most of the time. Your spindle's always there. So those delays help keep that spindle going all the way through time. The echoes also move it through time, because time is a big part of the scene that we've got here. Talking about pharaohs, old dead dudes, time. So again, contrary to what you would be told, find the character, find the role it's going to play, and push that. Ignore everything else. So we ended up with a really nice sound. Once I got this, then all the parts started to really come together. Before that, I'm still like, oh, I've got all these bits and they don't quite come together. That's the one. I found the one. So you find the one. It'd be easy to say, and as Frank had thought, you'd think, oh, it's going to be the pad. It was never the pad. Push that down right underneath, let it do its real job, which is being a pad, being a background we don't notice. But here's your spindle. So everything comes off this guy. Now we get into the interesting. Where's this guy? He's playing here. Just kill these guys. What a great sound. But again, a very disconnected line in the sense that it's not clear and playing all the time. It's fragmented. It needs to obviously be quite different from that spindle flute. The sound is different, so great choice there. It's a striking sound. It's almost like an overblown sort of a flute, but it needs to have more character. The basic sample again is a little a little polite. So I put a flanger on it. I'm not so much after the flangey whooshy effect. It's there, but it's done in such a way as to be not super noticeable. But I'm after the pushes that it gives to mid frequencies and the way that it changes things around. It tortures the sound a little bit. And this sound, this line here, it wants to have a feeling of some torture to it. So we've done that. I've used a feature in here to carry forward, which is what that stuff in the middle is about. I've then given it a bit of compression. Not a lot, I'm only after a tiny bit of compression, in part because the flanger is going to be unkind. There will be times where the frequency just goes wee, and the volume just goes wee, and it's not good. You need to control it. So that's set mostly to, as you'll see, fairly fast, mostly just to control. High threshold. We're not looking to change a lot. We're just looking to say, you shall not pass, which it does. That's what our compressor's doing. But then I've added this wee fellow. Bit rude. What this is doing is it's using a frequency shifter, which is kind of doubling as a slight ring modulator, which because of its pitching is behaving more like a tremolo. Layers complex. There's only a little bit of it, but it's also controlled via the envelope follower. You'll see here it has this envelope follower thing. I've used it slightly to influence the rate of the flanger. So the louder it is, the faster the oscillator goes. And the louder it is, the more that pushes the frequency shifter. So it actually just turns the knob. Let me put this out to wide for you. Nasty. But it's meant to be. But we're not running it like that. We're running a small amount of level and a small amount of. So it adds listen to the bite that it adds. Clean, bitey. Again. Clean, bitey. You hear how it starts to get a little bit. Where most people would be going, oh no, it's like, we need to EQ that out. I'm putting that in there. Because you know what? These instruments, they do sound like that. And we give them that kind of character. Because this is a tense sound, it's got fight in it. I'm going to make sure that we can hear the fight that's in it. If it was a real flautist playing his flaunt, however he's doing it, he's probably going to be into it. The sample doesn't give us that option, because it's meant to be as versatile, but I can put some in here. I can mean that mother up. So it's subtle. You're not going to go, oh, geez, that's a nastily messed up flute. But it's just got that little bit of bite in it, which helps it cut through. There is then the extra flute. This is the one that I carried forward, so you recognize it. That's even more tortured. I love that. That's a great sound. That's why I pulled this guy forward. We bypass, actually I'll do that individually. Just, actually no, there are three things. Nice. But again, it suffers from being a little too polite. So we put it through a lo-fi process, which, like the other flute, is a frequency shifter. We were looking to find, where can we find its nasty? Yep, there's some nasty in there. But we want a real feeling, so we don't want to overdo the nasty. But we need a little bit of it in there. So there's a little bit of nasty there, which has got, again, a little bit of envelope follower, moving some of the whatever happens inside this thing. I don't really know what happens inside the thing because they won't tell me. Like the other flute, it's got a lot of echo on it. It's reminding us that there's huge bits of time in here, and it helps tie all the parts together. So that's the biggest delay. It's a multi-tap delay with lots of delays and a bit of modulation and what have you. I modified a preset to give me the feel that I wanted there. The last thing I did here was use a trimmer. Now you probably noticed before that there was a lot of activity after we used the frequency shifter. I've cut it out here, but it's still there. It's not doing me any damage to get rid of it. It's not doing me any good having it there, so I'm getting rid of it. It's just easier to get a fairly aggressive beastie, hack it off. It's not doing me any good, so I'll get rid of it. That's him done. Better unsolo him. So those flutes together all really now have a spindle and a lot of character attached to them. We've got a harp. A harp doesn't play much of a role. It's a nice thing, but it's just a... Now in Frank's mix, he did seem to have this... I think it might have been ping-ponged for every note that it played, but bugger me if I was going to do that on a on a printed audio track. What I did was fairly simple. I used an LFO to spin the pan, so that's what you can hear there. Bit of EQ to really just pull out what I'm looking for. And again, I'm doing that in the mix. Well, it's tempting to go, ooh, there's lots of lovely stuff up at 8K. This is not a mix leading sound. It's one that just ping ping here and there. And you want to just kind of stand out, but not to overtake the track, which if I put a lot of air into it, it should be tempting. It's not going to play its role properly. And again, quite a lot of echo because it plays sporadically. It goes from sort of flat. It gives it a delicacy, and it's nice because those flute sounds are far from delicate by the time I'm done with them. They're quite, which is great. So we offset that with this delicate sound. Backwards. I don't really know what this is, but it's backwards. So I called it backwards. Because it came to me with no name on it. Didn't do anything to it. You see, I even forgot to low pass it. Hasn't caused me a problem, so it's not the end of the world. It just sits there, and I didn't feel the need to do much of anything to it other than put delay on it. Because everything else that's around it, I've decided that if we pair the harp and the backwards, it's a backwards what's I don't know. But they kind of often seem to play around each other, and their roles are not dissimilar. So I've given them both echoes. One's long, the other's short. Don't make the mistake of giving them both the same echo unless you've kind of decided to bust them. Otherwise, they'll just all the way through the mix. You want them to through the mix. That's that guy. And then we got this line. I got sent a line. Now, my first thing was because I didn't have a sound for it. It was kind of odd that he sent me this MIDI line rather than sending me a stem, because he sent me stems of everything else. I'd actually been asking for the MIDI of the whole piece, thinking that I would end up making the line because he didn't make it himself. But he sent me a line, and it's great, and I'm delighted he sent me his line. Actually, more delighted that he sent me his line. I just kind of think, well, why did you not send me your sound? But again, I'm delighted he didn't send me his sound because, and hopefully he's equally delighted, it allowed me to get creative with it. So we got a pair of sounds. I'll solo it from here. I started with an orchestral string sample just to be, well, okay, what's that going to sound like in the mix? So I went through and built all of the mix to this point, and that then gave me a sense of, well, what do I want this sound to do and be? The first thing that I grabbed was this fella, because I actually been using it in one of my own tracks. It's a resonator synth, so it's really designed, slightly physical modeling, but it was designed to be like some, I think they're dope for rack things, Euro rack things, where you can rub a coin on a panel and it would become an oscillator from that, from resonating and stuff. Scary shit. While it's not the easiest synth to use, you can get some really characterful sounds out of it. And I'd been playing with a sound, not this one, but I'd been playing with a characterful string sound. And I thought, this is going to be perfect for that sound because it's got that exotic, scrapey, grindy feel that you get in Middle Eastern instruments. And it's bright and it's wicked. Perfect for the theme. So, but not enough to do it on its own. So we brought in, what did I do in terms of EQ on this? I did nothing on this. It's just straight synth. That's all it is on that fella. And then this guy. I don't think there's any VST equivalent of this. Called Megasaw. It was really designed initially to do supersaws and to overdo supersaws. Each one of these is going to have a lot of saws all running at once, and if you watch, it'll even tell you how many you're running. 28 saws right now. I love it as a string synth. Beautiful as a string synth and pretty darn good as a choir synth as well. So we've run 3 oscillators at once. One of them has dropped an octave, but the volume's quite a bit lower. Kept that one mono, and this one, which is a bit quieter than full volume, I put out to stereo, because we want some stereo, but we don't want tons of stereo on there. So I wanted to keep processing to a minimum on this, because I'm not looking for a big synthy sound. I'm looking for something that could conceivably have been there. Again, that boost around 1,000, it's like, I want you to hammer through the middle, and when that comes in, it hammers. And that's the whole idea at that point, because up to this point we've been playing with all these bits and pieces that kind of Lego together. beautiful line. It works really, really nicely. So great work, Frank, in doing that, because you've taken a lot of the essence of the bits and pieces that are there. I haven't looked at the notes, obviously, because I don't know what they are through most of the piece, but you've taken that feel and what you've done and just rolled it all up into one thing, which is exactly what I was looking for. So super job. And remember, I pulled some of that through to the front of the piece. So that's sitting up here on the front of the piece, where we started with our flute, and then this, we echoed them out the front, which told us where we were going early on. And then when it hits, we're like, the payoff is immense at that point. It's super excited by that. Then we got these little vocal sections. Didn't do anything particular to them individually other than to get rid of some unnecessary, but it's then a case of what I did. Took some time on these guys. Now, I'll be intrigued to know where the vocals came from. Like, are they out of some kind of sample pack? Or Frank, did you make these yourself? They're interesting, but on their own, they lack the punch that we want. They don't need to be super loud, but they need to have punch. They need to be confident, and they lack that confidence in their sound. Again, very common when you're close miking for perfect. So put the confidence in. Use a tape, allow it to be bright, tiny bit of drive, but not enough to do anything dramatic. It adds a little bit of grain, tiny bit of compression. We do need to bring this up and sort of make it more like this, because it's prone to being thick and then thin, and as it goes up it becomes thin, which is not great in this situation. Cut out a lot of the lows. We just don't need that much going on in the lows here. I want body. Push the mids again, a little bit of highs, and I've used my friend the body here. So if we scooch your bad self back there. On its own, you can go, but Benedict, that sounds thin. Why did you cut all those lows out? You made it sound thin. Yes, I did, but I don't care, because in the mix it's not going to sound thin. Remember, we never make our decisions in solo. And then the body. It just helps, because one of the problems with taking samples, this could have been one sample. For all I know, it could have been one sample of someone going ooh or oh or whatever the words are, and then moving them. It does sound like they're moved, so you get that art of noise kind of feel. Problem with that is that we recognize human voices because they've got formants. You know, that's my one box out of which I resonate my voice. If you shift me with a pitch shifter or a sample where you change the notes, you're actually moving all of those things as well, when in reality they stay basically where they are. Whether I speak up here or down there, my formants are roughly the same. They move slightly, but not much, because that's my gob. Shifting them with a pitch shifter means that it's like you're reshaping the singer's mouth as well, which is weird, just kooky weird, like having a flow metal Terminator singing. It's not normal. So by applying a resonator, another body here, we're helping say to your mind, this is one voice changing pitch. You still get some of the samplery feel, but it feels more natural. So I'll just show you that difference again. So that one effect, or three effects at once. brought everything up, we've evened things out with the feeling that this is a single person rather than a collection of robots. Other situations I'd go with collection of robots. Lots of echo, lots and lots of echo. Because this is a character piece that appears. It's not really a lead line, it's a character piece. It's a bit that appears and goes, ooh. So we want that to echo over time. We also want to smooth out some of the unevenness of that. So echoes do that tremendously. I've really laid it on, but it works nicely. We've got another sound here, which really is exactly the same. I put the two together into a bus and processed them together. They've come out as though they're different instruments, and maybe they are. Maybe there's two different contact instruments or whatever. Don't know, it doesn't matter. But they're one voice. They don't act like they're two different people. Therefore, I'm going to say, okay, they're just the human element here, whatever that means. So I've put them through and homogenized them. Because otherwise, them seeming to have a different character from each other, yeah, how the characters are slightly different. Not a lot, but slightly. This again, using that process has just kind of pulled them into being kind of the same thing. That's all our elements. Towards the end of the mix, just had to work out how to make this finish nicely. We've got this was problematic with that flute. There's something about the sample. It did not like doing what it was asked to do here. Main lead. Actually, we'll get the so you can see what's happening here. If we mute this, we hear just this. Some of that's overdrive, but there's also a ragged sound in there. It's really ragged. So this is no longer so necessary at this time. You can still hear that ragged sound in there. The sample was never meant to do what it's being asked to do. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to say, how dare you do that, we need to fix this. No, musically it's a valid thing to do. Instrument-wise, maybe not, don't care. If it's outside the instrument's range, don't care. I just had to work out, how do I make that work? How do I solve that? I've pushed the overall volume up. I thought about, oh, do I just fade that track? But it wasn't comfortable. But I have done a pretty aggressive push here. So simply and in amongst everything else and all the echoes and the voices and what have you, no longer a drama. A little bit of texture, but that's nice. Who doesn't like a little bit of texture? So that was probably the biggest thing on the end. And now what did I do with that one? Oh yeah, I just overall turned the voices down at that point because they were just a bit too loud at the end. It just sounded a bit naff with them being overboard. And because I got a lot of echoes, kind of silent, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We want our 5 seconds of gap at the end, which is the palette cleanser before we come in with the next track. We don't know what the next track's going to be. Maybe Frank does, maybe he has the album running order already there, but it's always safest to have a palette cleanser. Let that really sort of fade away, let the brain clear, the emotions clear, have some sorbet, and what's going to come next is then a discrete story of its own. If Frank decides that he wants to overlap tracks, great, cool, but he's got options with that 5 second gap on the end, that breathing room. if this is on Spotify and it goes from here to Cannibal Corpse, there's that gap. And I'd hope that the end of the Cannibal Corpse track has that sort of gap, so that if it goes from there to here, we're going to feel a little bit like we can take the new thing in without it being an extension of Cannibal Corpse. I think it's Cannibal Corpse, it's just obviously you can see that these two may not feel good together, even though we could create some thematic ideas of them coming together. Imhotep! I think that's basically it. That's really the whole mix. The master, it's just the usual thing, tiny little bit of compression, a little bit of boost, a little bit of saturation to sparklify everything, tiny bit of stereo image, really, really tiny, just enough to bring ourselves up to 0 dB. I am not pushing these limiters, even in my loudest bits. See, I'm not asking my limiters to do anything, because while it's tempting to do that, not only will I get this is already peaking up to the sort of like it's peaking up above the 12. Therefore, I'm getting a crest factor that's reduced. So I start pushing into limiting. Yes, it'll be loud, but it'll be dynamically squashed. And we don't want this to feel squashed. This is about the fullness of time, not the fullness of time. So it's plenty loud enough. Best not to throw that up against the wall. It's not a tomato. It's a very delicate and textured piece of music. That really is the whole lot. No need for me to play this again. You can shuttle back. I'll make it obvious where the track is playing. And I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something from it. Frank, I hope you like this, because Frank doesn't get to hear this until now. If you're watching this going, gee, Benedict, I'd love to learn what you do with one of my tracks, contact me. I'm quite open. Remember, general rule of thumb is you don't get the mix, because it's not here for getting free mixes done for you. It's for learning, for yourself and for others. If I've just mixed this, I'm probably not looking to mix another one of these in a hurry. Doesn't mean I won't be interested in taking it up and putting it on the roster, but please don't just assume that I only ever mix one thing. That's childish. You don't want to work with a mix engineer who only ever mixes one thing, because he'll make you sound like everything he ever mixes sad, not a good plan. And go out, promote this. When you get one of these done, promote it, show people, because it's good for you, it's good for me, it's good for everybody. Thank you. You have a great day now.